Hello again, everybody. For this chapter, we're going to be kind of diving into a really big topic in the automotive world in general, and it's extremely relevant. We're going to be discussing alternative fuels and alternative methods of propulsion other than gasoline. Now, we will kind of give a little bit of a backstory on why gasoline still is king and why it's very, very difficult to replace. It is important to remember that when we're looking at replacing fossil fuels, it's not as easy as it may seem on talking points that you might see in the news. And oftentimes there can be information that kind of scares people. I'm going to do my best to dispel a lot of that and to prevent it from, kind of getting blown out of proportion and giving you as much knowledge as I can when it comes to that. Now, when we look at vehicles being propelled down the road, it is important to understand that we need energy to do that. Now, it's important to understand it's a basic rule of physics. You can't create energy, you can't destroy energy. However, we can harness it and then convert it to another form. So in the case of an internal combustion engine, we're taking the potential energy found in fuel. It's the potential chemical energy. We're compressing it, adding the right amount of air and a little bit of spark that creates an explosion. That explosion is contained, and that expansion of energy release from the chemical explosion is then redirected into rotary motion of the crankshaft, and then that then goes down into the transmission, into the drive wheels, and then creates kinetic energy for the vehicle to be powered forward. Now, there's benefits and negatives to all forms of energy use in propulsion of vehicles. I want to make that very, very clear. It's easy to find many people online that talk very, very confidently about a certain, this is the way to do it, or this is the way that you should do things. And I want to make sure it's very clear that understanding that there is no thing that is the silver bullet to kind of fix all of our issues. It's one of those things that there's going to be a multiple array of different types of propulsion that a lot of vehicles are going to be under, and it is going to vary greatly depending on how much of it is used in what areas. So it is going to be one of those things that's important that if you have really strong feelings about it, that's perfectly fine, but also understand that there's different ways to kind of tackle this problem. When we look at vehicles in general, we are having a big boom in electric vehicles, and I want to make sure it's very clear that electric vehicles is a very broad interpretation of a type of propulsion of vehicles. Oftentimes when we think of electric vehicles, we think of like a Tesla that's an all-electric vehicle. But that's not the case. Any vehicle that uses an electric motor as an assist or as its primary means of propulsion is considered an electric vehicle. Now, personally, I'm very much enthusiastic on performance. And on the slide is, if you were to give me no budget on what car I would go for in terms of an electric vehicle, you're looking at it in that exact trim. I very much like the Taycan Turbo S fastback. I forget what exact spec the trim level is off the top of my head now, but it's carbon ceramic brakes, big time performance car, and it's a station wagon. Clicks all the boxes. On top of that, you make it green. It is exactly what I want. And you can have a very, very enthusiastic or vehicle that can make you exciting that is electric. Now, I prefer internal combustion just because of the way that it my passion with it, but it is one of those things you need to be very open to the fact that in the future we probably will be driving vehicles that are propelled differently than they are now, and that's perfectly fine. Now, when we look at why this is the case, there's a couple reasons. So the first reason is not as much of a reason anymore, simply because we've gotten extremely efficient in terms of extracting oil from the ground. But production of fossil fuels does take a lot of energy, a lot of effort, and can be relatively dangerous because oftentimes these finite resources are found in very inhospitable, very uneasy areas to get. And it does mean that we have to put a fair amount of effort in. That does also contribute to emissions. We're also looking at, too, the fact that there's going to be a big difference from the operating emissions of a vehicle when the vehicle is used simply as a car versus its cradle to grave. And we'll kind of go into that here in just a second. So when we look at that as a whole, now this isn't in the book. I want to make sure that this is clear. This is stuff that I've added for you for your benefit to kind of give you some basis on when we're looking at things to kind of help you, not pigeonhole an opinion. Now, when we look at cradle to grave, what that means is how much energy it takes to produce the vehicle, getting all the materials, refining the materials, assembling the individual components, transporting those components into a central location to assemble the vehicle, transporting that vehicle to its ultimate sale market, because that's another important thing to understand. And then from there, vehicle operation. Once the vehicle's use is now no longer necessary or deemed not cost effective, the destruction of that vehicle, hopefully it gets recycled, but that process in terms of getting all of those resources back out of that vehicle and properly disposing of it. And that's when we need to look at like the actual lifespan of any material item. We're going to be discussing vehicles, but you need to look at that, think about the computer, phone, tablet that you're looking at this video on. There's no emissions really coming off of it as itself, and we don't really have a choice on how you're able to charge it in terms of where you're getting your electricity from, but there is a set amount of emissions that was emitted to create that device, as well as there will be to properly recycle that device. And electronic devices do need to be recycled properly. Same thing with the vehicle. So we're looking on average for a gasoline-powered vehicle. It creates 7 tons of CO2 when built and assembled. Now that 7 tons of CO2, you need to kind of take quantitatively. So that goes from mining the materials, the steel, aluminum, the petroleum products to make the plastics and other composites, then to ship those to some place where they can be refined, assembled, and each one of those individual components then gets sent to the assembly plant. I want to make it very clear that no vehicle is 100% built. All the materials are refined and raw materials go in and the vehicle comes out. We are very much a global market in terms of materials and componentry for a vehicle are all around the world. You can have stuff for a Japanese vehicle. The vehicle might be assembled in Japan, but we have steel coming from Greater Asia, or we have computer components coming from India, or we have the internal combustion engine being assembled in the United States and then shipped across to then be assembled to then send that vehicle somewhere else. So it is one of those things. There's a lot of effort with that. So we're looking at 7 tons to build and assemble it. We're looking at around 50 tons during the average operation of that vehicle. Now, when we look at the average age of a vehicle on roadways today, it's about 12.1 years. So we're looking at that being the average. That meaning there's vehicles that are on the road a lot less and get recycled. There's also vehicles that are on the road for a lot longer. So we're looking at that average of, around a 12.5-year lifespan for a vehicle, about 50 tons of CO2 produced on average. Now, when we look at an EV vehicle, it takes 14 to 20 tons of CO2 when building and assembling that. Now, effectively, if it is a zero emission vehicle, initial operation, the CO2 level is almost not measurable. It is producing CO2 in terms of the plastics and composites do radiate out a measurable amount of CO2. It's not anything to really argue this. Now, depending on where that energy is coming from, though, however, to create that vehicle, that is another thing all in itself. Now, a majority of our electric vehicles out there today are using some form of a lithium battery, either lithium composites, lithium ion, lithium polymer, lithium graphite, whatever it may be. There's some form of lithium construction in those batteries. Lithium mining is very, very toxic. It's also very, very harmful. There's a couple different ways that we can get it. Now, the downside to lithium mining, for instance, in South America, is it uses a lot of water, and where we're getting lithium is usually off of already dry lake beds. and we reflood them and let them evaporate out, and that's when we can get the solid lithium. The downside is that's displacing water that otherwise would be going to farmers or people that live in that area. On top of it's very toxic. It's very, very bad to be breathing. It's open air. You can't really contain it because we do need the water to evaporate off. So that's where you'll see like the satellite footages or videos or aerial footages of lithium mines where there's these really wild color like turquoise and yellow and bright kind of colored water, and that's the lithium being separated out in that process, and that does require a whole lot of energy. On average, and this is data coming from Volvo, and I want to make it very clear, Volvo has stated that they want to be all electric or have an electric high voltage electric option for all their vehicles by 2025, so only a couple of years down the road. Volvo states it takes over 11 years for a fully EV vehicle to be less emissions emitting than a gasoline equivalent. Now, when we're looking at that 12 and a half year lifespan, there's really not a big trade-off there. So if you're looking at getting an electric vehicle because you want it for it to be better for the environment, you probably need to look elsewhere. And that's just kind of basic, the nuts and bolts with it. Now, I haven't brought up the amount of energy that it takes to dispose of these vehicles. Now, when it comes to recycling the frame of any vehicle, whether or not it's electric or whether or not it's gasoline, we can reuse a vast majority of those materials. The steel, aluminum, copper, brass, gold, everything that's in that does get reused and is easily recycled. And there's, a set amount of CO2 emissions that's created with that. The hard part with electric vehicles, however, though, is that battery pack. Now, that being said, there's a lot of technology out there to be able to reuse the battery packs. And, you can take 12 electric cars that might have a couple dead cells, and you can remove those dead cells and then link those batteries together to then make a new remanufactured battery pack for an electric bus. And that lithium can be reused. So that is a good thing. And that's one of those things that if any of you are looking to jump into an industry or create a company, battery reallocation or remanufacturing, that's going to be a big thing here in the next 5 to 20 years, simply because we're going to have to do it because lithium is very finite, and a battery can go bad and it can only be 1 or 2 cells, and we can reuse that. So that aspect is starting to get a lot cleaner than it used to be. Other than that, it was, we were shipping these batteries overseas where they were getting recycled and not necessarily the best way for the environment. And when we're looking at that, we don't want to be sending our pollution overseas. It's not fair to those countries. It's not fair to anyone in general. So it is one of those things we want to make sure we have that understanding with vehicles. Now, gasoline still is king for the most part, and it's king because of a couple different reasons. Big reason is we already have the infrastructure in place. Now, per 2017, and I want to make sure that that's clear that this is several years back. The pandemic threw a wrench in that, so we can't really look at data from 2019 into about 2022. That data is kind of corrupt. But if we look at 2017 numbers, the United States uses approximately 385 million gallons of gasoline per day. It's countrywide. Now, that being said, we're a very, very large country. We're also a very mobile country when compared to other countries in the world in terms of individual self-propulsion. Really no other country on the planet is like us in terms of you have to have a car to get around. Many other large metropolitan areas and well-developed countries do have public transport that reduces that consumption. But here in the United States, it's not really possible. We have to have everyone be driving a car for the most part, just for how our cities and towns and states are laid out. With gasoline, one of the drawbacks, we have the advantage to the convenience. The convenience is there. It's very, very convenient to be able to fill your car up with gasoline. We don't nearly have the supply chain issues that were around in the late 70s, excuse me, as we once did. And occasionally there's some supply chain issues in terms of, a couple refineries can go down, but that typically doesn't result in issues with getting fuel. Now, in this last winter that was kind of cold, there was areas in the center of the country that had issues getting diesel fuel, but that's for other reasons, primarily for energy production that are using diesel plants. But when it comes to gasoline for the average consumer, it's not that big of a deal as it once was. However, big downside though is the emissions that come out. The emissions are very, very harmful to not only our immediate health but our overall environment around us. And we looked at that when we were talking about chapter 17. We kind of got deeper into that. Now there is, these ratings that all the vehicles have to meet to. It's called the CAFE rating, or the Cooperative Average Fuel Economy. I want you to keep a fine eye on that cooperative average, corporate average, and when we're looking at that, we're looking at excuse me, I kept saying that wrong. My dyslexia got the best of me. We're looking at the average of the entire fleet of vehicles that manufacturer is producing. So we've messed with the PT Cruiser in lab. That PT Cruiser, if you look at how it's classified through the DMV paperwork, everyone would look at that being it's a 5-passenger front wheel drive car. That's what everyone would initially look at it as. It's not. It's actually it's considered a truck. And the reason why it's considered a truck is because that being a 4-cylinder small vehicle, it's better fuel economy when compared to an actual frame on body pickup truck that Chrysler was producing, would increase the CAFE average for a Chrysler in getting that average in line. And that was one of the tricks that manufacturers used to do. You could buy a small van or a small hatchback and it would be considered a pickup truck, even though for all intents and purposes, in terms of argument's sake, it's not a pickup truck. Now, manufacturers are, instead of doing that kind of, terminology kind of loophole, instead they're electrifying everything or adding electrification to additional vehicles. Now, when we look at our emission standards, and it can feel like, and I definitely get this feeling working in the industry and being enthusiastic about the industry, it can feel like when there's talk of climate change and when there's talk of how we can mitigate it, that people tend, or pundits or whatever, politicians tend to focus on car emissions. And the reason for that is it's low-hanging fruit. It's something that's quantitative, right? We can look out your window, or you can look out wherever you're at, and you can see that there is cars around, and that all of these gas cars that are driving around are putting out emissions. So it's one of those, okay, we can handle that. Now, when we look at electricity and production in terms of our house, we don't see that. You probably all would be pretty hard up to figure out where your local substation is that's producing electricity for you. And here in Southern California and South Orange County, it used to be easy a couple of years ago. About 10 years ago, it was really easy. You could go, it's San Onofre Nuclear Power Plant. That's not the case anymore. We've gone to natural gas because that power plant has been turned off. And when we look at agriculture, same thing. We can't really see that as a big thing. But electricity production and agriculture are about half of our greenhouse gas emitters in the country. So when we're looking at that, it is kind of not fair that they pick on transportation. However, transportation is the easiest to tweak in terms of it's easier to convert into vehicles being electric and low emission. Now, it is important to understand that will just kind of transfer over that CO2 to an extent to energy production. So we do have to kind of be mindful of how we're producing energy. And when I say producing energy, again, it's important to understand we can't create energy. We're just converting it. If we're using natural gas to turn a gas turbine to create electricity that can then go out to homes, that's, transformation of that energy use. Now, we probably do as a whole want to start looking into more renewable energies in terms of energy production. I am a big advocate for nuclear power. That's kind of a hot take, depending on who you ask. Ultimately, it's the most efficient on all aspects. Yes, it is dangerous. However, it's one of those things that the danger can be mitigated, and it is a better option than a lot of the others. However, Depending on the area, we might be able to do geothermal, we might be able to do solar, we might be able to do wind, and that's, or tidal flow. All of those are different alternatives to burning fossil fuels for energy production, which would then make electric vehicles far more greener because we're not using fossil fuels to create electricity to then put into an electric vehicle. We can be all around a little bit greener. Now, kind of keeping with the theme on why gasoline is king, again, it's the most efficient. Now, when we do look at this chart, and we've seen this chart earlier in our discussions, we are looking at the British thermal units to combust, or that come out of an average gallon of gasoline. So this is the potential energy that has is 114,100 BTUs, or British thermal units. When we look at like ethanol, which is a renewable source of energy, we're looking at that being only 81,800. So it's about a third, a little bit more than a third less efficient. We have to consume a little bit more. Now, when we get to diesel, though, however, diesel is better. And diesel is actually a byproduct of refining gasoline and refining other plastics. It is something that would be considered a waste item. However, we've gotten really good as human beings to use every aspect of the petroleum products that we do pull from the earth. We use almost everything. There's no waste whatsoever. However, the downside is the emissions to diesels are very, very high. And those are directly affected the operator and the surrounding areas. So that's why you don't see diesel as much. Now, we do look down and we can see biodiesel, so B20 and B100. These are interesting. So these are going to be diesels that are more renewable. So these two right here, or not methanol. Methanol fuel is a different topic all in itself, but these two fuels right here are going to get us kind of something interesting. Biodiesel technically is renewable. It can be used from burning cooking oil. It can be used from burning rendered animal fat, any number of things. And when we're looking at that, B20 is 20% biodiesel, 80% regular petroleum diesel. B100 is 100% biodiesel. And our 100% biodiesel is more efficient than gasoline. Now, it's not necessarily feasible on top of the reliability of the vehicle is a lot less than it otherwise would have. We have to have very, very high filtration in our fuel system. We have to be doing a lot more maintenance. So in terms of, you might be thinking like, well, why don't we just all have biodiesel vehicles and we just run off of cooking oil or anything like that? The cooking oil itself, there's a finite amount of that. As many taco shops and Chinese food restaurants, it might have 55 gallons of waste cooking oil outside of their restaurant at any one time. There's more of a demand in the area than there would be for that. Now, where we will see biodiesel working its way into probably a more usable, sustainable area would be on farms that have a larger, especially like a cattle dairy farm or a poultry farm. We have the ability to run vehicles off biodiesel. They can do biomass off of the waste product of the animals, and that can then power the tractors, and that can then help reduce the cost for those items for us as a whole. So it is one of those things that it is that is an interesting thing. Now, methanol, as you can see, methanol right here, we're about half of that of what gasoline is. So we need about double the amount to have the equivalent efficiency. However, methanol has a way bigger boom. It's also way more unstable, and it was thought to be an option for fuel for power in vehicles. It is not stable enough. It is extremely dangerous to fill. It's extremely dangerous to be around. One of the things that I encourage everyone to do, if any of you, see yourself as an automotive enthusiast, you want to look at potentially going to the Winter Nationals. Everyone has to do it once, even if drag racing is not your thing. What the Winter Nationals is a San NHRA kind of finale that they do for the drag racing season. And it is held in Pomona, California, just up the street, a couple hours away. And the cool thing with that is it's all open pits. So you can walk the pits, you can watch all of the dragsters getting worked on. You can see all the professional drivers right then and there. You can't do that in any other sporting event, right? Why I bring up methanol is those are all nitromethane powered. So they're running an extremely volatile fuel. When we're looking at these dragsters, we're looking at about 30,000 horsepower per dragster. And it's enough to shake the earth and basically make you go deaf. If you're not wearing headphones like what I'm wearing right now, you're in for a very, very pain-inducing process to your ears. But that methanol fuel, if you're by those when they light off, that methanol fuel is like being tear gassed. It's insane on how caustic it is for you and how much it hurts. But it's one of those things you need to go and experience NHRA drag racing and actually see it in person. There's nothing like it. It's one thing to be at like a basketball game or a baseball game when you can feel that it's electrified where everyone's excited. And that's one thing. It's another when you're in the stands of a drag strip and literally two alcohol funny cars or two alcohol top fuel cars are going down the track, or sorry, nitromethane cars I should say, going down the track and literally shaking the entire grandstand and just ear piercing hard enough, vibration of noise to where you feel it in your chest. You feel the pressure increase from that air. There's nothing like it. Same thing if any of you can too, before they remodel California Speedway, you need to go see a NASCAR race too, because when they have 48 cars going down the front straightaway and it's shaking the grandstands, and it's a very, very impressive experience. So it's something that I recommend for everyone. Now, when we look at LPG and CNG, these are using natural gas, and they're efficient to an extent, but not as much so. There's also big drawbacks to the filling process of both of these that we'll talk about here in a little bit. Now, when we look at electrification and hydrogen, these are both one and the same. Hydrogen propulsion, for the most part, on vehicles that are equipped now are more or less electric vehicles. It's using a PEM cell to create electricity so that we can move an electric motor. We are getting into, Toyota is very much behind wanting to get into hydrogen combustion, which is an interesting endeavor because that would kind of keep our ability to convert vehicles over very easily, and an option that is out there. But those, again, our efficiency is a little bit lower than it otherwise would have. So the goal is to try to find a renewable replacement for gasoline, again, for the reasons, of production limitations and the emissions. One of the alternatives that is being looked at is E85, or ethanol alcohol burning fuel. When we look at E85, E85 is a blend of 85% ethanol or renewable fuels and 15% gasoline. In North America, we're getting this off of corn or grain alcohol. In other areas, so like in Brazil, they run off 100% E85, and they're using sugarcane. And sugarcane is used, around the equator area or more tropical areas, grows better than it does for corn. Now, it is a renewable resource because we can plant more of it. The downside is, though, again, it's not as efficient when it comes to gasoline. When we're looking at equivalency of the amount of gas we need, if for 10 gallons of gas, we're going to need 13.9, or just about 14 gallons of 85 to go the same distance. Now, E85 has a lot of performance benefits in terms of it is far less pre-ignition. There's less pre-ignition issues with it, so it's less prone to knock or detonation. Which is a benefit if we're trying to increase power with adding forced induction, and it's a lot cheaper. It's far more cheaper to pay for, and that's because its refining costs are a lot lower because it's produced onshore. However, it is one of those things that it is taking potential food stores, and we do have a really big issue not only around the world but in this country of there being a lot of people suffering from hunger. So it is one of those things that there is kind of a moral issue in terms of creating alcohol stock off of grain or sugar is probably fine to burn in that case, but to that could otherwise be used to be feeding people. And there is, when we look at the sugarcane production down in Brazil, it does cut up, finite areas of the rainforest. And that, again, is an added thing that has to be considered. Now, I'm not trying to be a downer with this. I'm just trying to make sure that everyone has this understanding of there's, again, no one all be all for this. Now, E85 is something that you can get fairly regular. When you look at a gas station, you look at the black pumps being gasoline, green pumps being ultra low sulfur diesel number 2. And typically if it's yellow, it's going to be E85. Now, not all vehicles can run off E85. Alcohol fuels are extremely caustic in terms of breaking down rubber and plastic components. You have to convert all of that over. Our Time Attack NSX, it has where we run off E85 mainly for cost benefit and for lack of pre-detonation. But we had to go through and completely redo our fuel system in terms of we had to do a special coating on the inside of our aluminum tank. We had to have specific, we run 3 fuel pumps, but we had to have specific alcohol resistant fuel pumps, alcohol resistant lines, alcohol resistant injectors, filters. All of that stuff had to be changed over for us to be able to operate the vehicle. On top of that, one of the things that I want to make sure that's very clear for any of you, looking at converting to 85 for performance aspect, very rarely are you getting a perfect 85% mixture of ethanol and 15% mixture of gasoline. It's very rarely that. The best that I've seen, and we've gone around the country with this Time Attack team, and we've gotten 85 from multiple different sources. The best we've ever seen is around 80%, 80, 81% alcohol versus it's gasoline. Now, the reason why we're able to detect that is we have what's called a flex fuel sensor on our vehicle, and that is sampling the alcohol content going into our supply line for our fuel system, so that we can adjust the tune accordingly, so that we're not adjusting for 85% alcohol and then having the vehicle not have that and then go into a situation where we're running too lean. So it is important to make sure you have that as an understanding. Is more often than not, it should be E75 or sometimes E70 if the station doesn't get a lot of traffic and it's able to separate out. Also, too, bear in mind that you do want to keep in mind where these filling stations are located. Now, we talked a little bit briefly on biodiesel. Biodiesel is kind of interesting that effectively it is zero emissions in terms of its carbon neutral, that we are putting the carbon back into the land and then we're extracting it. Biodiesel blends, again, usually we're looking at about 20%. Most ultra low sulfur diesel is B5, so it's 5% biodiesel renewable process. And it is an interesting fuel type. And again, in certain areas, this is going to be a really, really good option when we look at agriculture or light construction, where we can have a very ample, reliable source of renewable biodiesel. Again, as I brought up, it does take a lot more vehicle maintenance. It is kind of one of the long-term projects I want to do here on campus. Is we do have a Ford New Holland tractor that is a non-common rail diesel, which are very easily converted to biodiesel. I'd like to be able to take the cooking grease that culinary uses, that otherwise they would have to recycle and use that to power our tractor. So kind of an option that we're looking at with that. Other options are using natural gas. Now, natural gas is a lot cleaner burning than that of gasoline. It also, too, natural gas pockets are always above oil, so it is one of those things that when we're actually drilling and pulling it out of the ground, we do have natural gas that we can capture and then use. Now, there's 2 different forms that we can get this. We can get this in CNG, or compressed natural gas, and this is where we're compressing it upwards of 3,600 PSI, or there is LNG, which is liquefied natural gas. Now, liquefied natural gas, we have to have at a very low temperature, negative 263 degrees Fahrenheit, and it has its limitations in being able to be used on an average passenger vehicle. We do see CNG used on passenger vehicles quite a bit. Oftentimes they will be used on municipality vehicles, so pickup trucks, buses, stuff like that. And we'll see LNG used on more larger equipment. in some aspects of cars and trucks, but not as much. For the most part, we're seeing CNG. Now, I do realize this slide is incorrect per the book, but this is what the book's data says. CNG can be used in trains, transit buses, and semi trucks, but we do see it in cars. Honda had a fleet of Civics that you could buy. You could buy a CNG powered Civic there, and they worked really well when the fueling stations were around. Now, the downside is filling can be time consuming. Why this works for municipalities is municipality could have a natural gas tank on site and they could fill vehicles overnight. If it is a low pressure filling system, it can take upwards of 7 to 8 hours to equalize the tank pressure for the vehicle as well as what the feed tank is to be able to get a full charge of gas in that sense, or a full income of gas. High pressure filling stations like what's photoed here are a lot quicker, on average, like 15-20 minutes. However, it is one of those things that there's a different process to doing it, and that kind of then defeats the purpose. Now, where we do see a lot of CNG or LNG being used is going to be in a biofuel vehicle. Now, biofuel vehicle can be under a bunch of different terms, but it's effectively using two fuel systems, and that's what we would use on our tractor. Our tractor would be biofuel. It would run off 100% diesel fuel at cold temperatures and right before we'd shut it off. And then once the fuel was warmed up, because we would have to have a fuel warmer, it would run off B100, and we would switch to a set of pumps and go off of a different tank. So we were running the cooking oil then at that point. But we can do the same thing with CNG or LPG. We can also do it with flex fuel vehicles as well. So you might see a lot of GM vehicles have they're marked as flex vehicles. So what they can operate off is they can operate off of E85 or regular gasoline, and the vehicle can detect that. In terms of that type of vehicle, it's all the fuel is going in the same tank. But when we look at a true biofuel vehicle, we're looking at having two separate fuel tanks, one for conventional gasoline or diesel, the second one being for again either biomass or LNG, CNG, and that's not as common as it used to be. That was really popular in the late 80s, 90s, and very early 2000s, but we've kind of gone away from that again because of the use of electric batteries and that kind of being the more easy option. Now, something that is kind of exciting, that is interesting, that the Volkswagen Auto Group through Porsche is experimenting with is synthetic fuels. Now, synthetic fuels are scrubbing. Effectively, what they're doing is they're scrubbing the air through a reverse osmosis effect to get carbon monoxide and carbon out of the air, and then reblending that into fuel use. So effectively, it's a carbon neutral form of fuel, because we're already taking the carbon that's in the air and the atmosphere and then putting it back into the vehicle to where the vehicle then reemits it. We're having a net neutral effect on carbon use. Now, when we're looking at this is still in the experimental phase. Currently, there's a couple facilities in Chile that are doing this, and there's a reason why they're down there, because there's very open areas that they can kind of do an experiment on how much they're actually scrubbing from the air. Currently, it's extremely expensive. It's like $40 or $50 a gallon, but that's because it's in its infancy in terms of technology. And what we're seeing is we're able to take that air, scrub that out. That's again, it being done by Volkswagen Auto Group. That's why this slide's in German, because that's the only information I can get, is I have to run it through Google Translate. But effectively what we're doing is we're incoming CO2 and water, and then we're getting the synthetic fuel out. It is, again, still in its infancy, but it is kind of an exciting proposition. We can possibly use this to create fuel. And again, I want to make sure that it's understood that there's going to be multiple different ways that we're able to create to harness electricity or harness potential energy to be able to get our vehicles to move down the road. Now, the other one that I'm really excited about, and I think is probably our best bet in terms of kind of solving the issue in terms of energy generation for vehicles is hydrogen. There's two forms that we can use hydrogen with. We can either combust it because it is very flammable, or we can use it in a PEM cell. We can mix hydrogen with oxygen. That effect creates an electrical charge. We shed some electrons, and that can then be used to be powered an electric vehicle. So both methods work. Now, hydrogen, it's the most abundant element in our known universe. It's basically everywhere. If you look up at the sky, don't look too long at it or you'll go blind, but we have effectively a giant hydrogen generator up in the sky, and that's our sun. Our sun is a fusion reactor. Effectively, we're fusing hydrogen together to create helium up in the sun there, and that's how every star operates. Now, when we're looking at this, though, hydrogen is very, very abundant. However, the best way I can put it is it's very sticky in terms of it likes to cling to other elements and can be very difficult to separate or labor intensive to separate. Where we see a lot of hydrogen on our planet is connected with oxygen, and it's with water. Now, we can separate it and we can get it to be individualized, but that does take a lot of energy to do. So currently, again, with it still in its infancy, is not very easy to do. Now, each hydrogen atom contains one negatively charged electron and one positively charged proton. Now, when we're looking at that, we're looking at that being a very, very simple atom base, and that movement of the electrons from one form of the hydrogen molecule to another is how we can have a PEM cell operate. So the PEM cell is going to be a chemical reaction that happens inside of an electric vehicle. The best way to look at it is it's we're converting the potential energy of the hydrogen when we mixed with oxygen in the air to create electricity to then go into a battery and power the vehicle. So we're going to have three components. Again, I want to stress there's no moving parts in these. This is all done individually. We have an anode where the electrodes are lost, and then electrolyte, and a cathode where the electrons are gained. Effectively, this catalyst in between is going to induce this chemical reaction to happen. And effectively, that's where we get the name PEM, because it's a proton exchange membrane. What we have is we have a transfer of the hydrogen being pumped in mixed with oxygen as the other inlet, that going over the cathode for the oxygen, the anode for the hydrogen. As it goes through the catalyst, it combines and creates a positively charged hydrogen molecule. The output of that is going to be water. So we combine that with the oxygen, and the exhaust effectively is going to be simply water. So if you've ever followed behind a Honda Insight or a Toyota Mirai, you'll see it's like an excited puppy to see you. When it leaves a stoplight, there's a puddle on the ground, and that is the exhaust. Now, that allows us to send that electricity that's created off of the anode and cathode, getting the negatively charged and positively charged electrons to create electricity. We store that in a small battery pack that can then drive a drive motor. Now, again, there's no moving parts in this PEM cell. However, the reason why these aren't as abundant as gasoline engines is the reliability wasn't there. They did wear out fairly easily, and they were very, very expensive. I do work with the hydrogen fuel cell alternative propulsion lab with UCI, and they were one of the leaders in helping Toyota develop their systems. And they had some pretty early teething issues. Now they've gotten to where it's pretty reliable. The Toyota Mirai, which is the highest selling hydrogen vehicle in the United States, is very, very reliable. This system I like a lot, again, because we're able to not be rendered, the vehicle be rendered obsolete during the charging state, especially when we have high demand for charge. We can fill a vehicle up with hydrogen very quickly, and that compressed hydrogen can be safely stored in a tank. And we're looking at 3 to 5 minutes of filling time, and then you're back on the road. The Toyota Mirai gets around a 300-mile range. Now, the maximum range isn't really what you want to look at in terms of how a vehicle is going to operate, because no one ever operates it off of that. When we look at range, we're looking at, well, how long is it going to be before I have to go and actually get out of the vehicle and fill it up with fuel? That's not the way we want to look at it, but its energy density is there. We can also, too, when we look at this system in practice, we already have a very extensive network of gas stations around the country that are already pre-existing. We've already spent the energy to level the land, put a pad down, put the pumps, put the tanks, and have that all created. What if instead we took half of those pumps and made them hydrogen filling stations? So if you have a station that has 8 pumps, for instance, you have 4 be normal gasoline and diesel, and the other 4 be hydrogen. That infrastructure is already existing. We don't have to create a new one. When we look at full electrified vehicles, we're having to create areas and charging points, and the surface areas that those take up are far greater. When you're looking at demand for electric charging stations, the demand goes up, the amount of power outflow goes down. So if you have a charging station that has 20 stalls and 18 of them are being used, it's going to slow down the whole process for everyone, and it takes up a lot more space than otherwise would for these already pre-existing gas stations. So that's kind of my thought process. I know it's kind of out of left field, but it is one of those potential options that are out there. Now, currently there's actually 4 hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that you can buy. And here in Orange County, we're actually in one of the only areas that you can buy these vehicles. There's roughly, I want to say it's in the 60s for filling stations in the United States. And the majority of them are in Southern California, between here and the Bay Area. So LA, Orange County, San Diego has a couple, and then there's a couple in the Bay Area, and there's one in between, so that you can do the link in between. But you can get the Honda Clarity, Hyundai, I forget what their new one's called. It's not the Tucson anymore, and then the Toyota Mirai. Toyota Mirai is in its 2nd generation, and it's actually gone up in terms of how much mileage it is. Now, all of the manufacturers, because this is an experimental form of energy propulsion, they do typically pay for your first 3 years of fuel for free. So it is one of those that you don't have any fuel costs incurred for the first 3 years of operation. In terms of what it charges, it varies depending on the demand at the station, but it's starting to get down to the equivalency of what a gallon of gas is. Now, when we look at a PEM cell vehicle, we're looking at it being constructed a little bit different. We will have a battery setup because we will be storing that electricity, but we will have hydrogen fuel tanks. Now, the hydrogen fuel tanks are very, very stringently, they have a lot of heavy safety standards because of the fear that everyone has with hydrogen. So they typically are able to withstand far greater accident than the occupants or the rest of the vehicle can. And they're usually going to be centrally located in carbon fiber wound cylinders. They're going to be round cylinders because it's safer in terms of pressure release with those. Now, this system is going to then be pumped into the PEM cell itself. And the PEM cell can be located in a couple different areas. In the case of this diagram, it's located down in the floor of the vehicle. We're looking at that being pretty atypical in terms of where it can be located. Sometimes it is under the hood, and that will then be sending power to an electric motor that will then propel the vehicle down the road. One of the things that we do have to have for these PEM cell systems to operate is the thermal efficiency has to be just right. PEM cells are just like human beings. They like about 72 degrees. To maintain that, we have to have really extensive thermal system. So when we look at this vehicle, its diagram, we're looking at, we have 3 radiators up front. Those 3 radiators are necessary to maintain that operating temperature for this system to function. We're going to have one heat exchanger or one radiator for the high voltage battery system, and then the other two to maintain the temperature of the PEM cell. That's why when you look at like a Toyota Mirai, oftentimes people go like, "Oh, it's a koi fish. It's got this big open grill." That's so there's a lot of airflow over these heat exchangers. There's a reason for that vehicle design. Now, the tank safety, again, when we're looking at that, these are carbon fiber wrapped tanks. They're mounted center midship of the vehicle, again, to prevent any type of puncture. They're designed to basically survive the crash to where the occupants couldn't. The risk is of if they get punctured and then they burn. Hydrogen fuel burns very, very hot, almost to where it's a clear flame and you can't see it. In fact, first responders are trained, if it's a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, to approach in a single file line with the first person in front holding a straw broom in front of them. If the broom lights on fire, then they know that there's flames. The reality is hydrogen is very, very light molecule, and it goes up and rises into the air and effectively puts itself out. So a hydrogen fire would burn very, very quickly and then put itself out. However, if it gets hot enough to where it's burning the other componentry in the vehicle, then that would effectively be very dangerous, and you wouldn't want to be around that either way. So there is a lot of safety that goes along with that, those tanks. Now, when we look at hybrid and electric vehicles, there's a multiple amount that you can choose from. We're kind of in the infancy, we're past the infancy stage, and we're kind of going into the toddler stage of electric vehicles. You can get electrified just about everything. And most manufacturers have committed to where they're going to have fully electric fleets or electric options for their fleets within the very, very near future. A lot of manufacturers, Cadillac, for instance, Volvo, as stated before, 2025 is like the point where they're all pushing towards where they're going to be almost full electric. Which is, just around the corner. It's only a couple of years away. So it is one of those things that when we're looking at that being the case, a lot of people get very, very scared with the California mandate that by 2035 that everything will be electrified and you can't buy an internal combustion engine vehicle. Don't get too stressed with that. That's new car sales. That's also a really long way away, and the government tends to push stuff back. On top of that, most manufacturers are going to do it well ahead of time. Now, some of you might be thinking like, well, why would a company like Cadillac, for instance, that used to have 500 cubic inch V8s in their vehicles, why would they go to electrified? Well, simply it's cost. When you look at the amount of pieces of equipment and special tooling and materials that it takes to build an internal combustion engine, average internal combustion engine is going to have several thousand parts, right? And be potentially on the hook for upwards of 10 years warranty-wise for any of those parts failing. Manufacturer is more than happy to go and electrify a vehicle to reduce cost. That will reduce their overall warranty claims over the life of that vehicle. It reduces the production cost in terms of an electric motor has only a couple parts versus a internal combustion engine has many. They also then don't have to worry about emissions outputs. They don't have to stress about making sure that CAFE level is where they need to. So it is, more indicative to better business for an auto manufacturer to convert to electric than it would be to go to stay with gasoline. We see that too. I oftentimes have students going, well, manuals are dying because no one wants to buy them. It's manufacturers don't want to produce them. It's a higher warranty cost for a manual transmission, and the emission standards are kind of up in the air based off of how the vehicle is being driven. Automatic can be computer controlled, and that can be very, very closely monitored by the vehicle's operating system. So we'll see that being the case in a lot of ways. Now, let's talk about hybridization though. So not all vehicles that are electric vehicles will be simply just full electric. A lot of them will still have a internal combustion engine in some sort, and there's a couple different ways that they can be constructed. Now, when we're discussing hybrids, there's going to be mild hybrids and then there's full hybrids. Some areas you can see it's called a strong hybrid. Thankfully, that awkward terminology is not really catching on everywhere. But it's effectively the same way you can call the same thing. We're looking at a full hybrid being any type of vehicle that is 144 volts and up. So anything with orange wiring is what we're going to consider a full hybrid. Now, when we're looking at most hybrid vehicles, we are looking at them being paired with an internal combustion engine, either to allow for energy production only, or to allow for a parallel drive system. Effectively, we have drive motors that are going to be doing the propulsion of the vehicle at low speed, and or all speeds, and then it will be paired with an internal combustion engine at that point. Now, when we're looking at being propelled off of a full electric mode, it's going to be an EV car in that sense, and the internal combustion engine is basically on for the ride. However, when we do need an internal combustion engine to be utilized to maintain vehicle pace or increase the vehicle's velocity, we can have a far smaller sized one over what we would otherwise need. Now, large displacement engines are necessary to produce enough torque to be able to get a vehicle to go off the line. And we have to operate that vehicle at a specific RPM to get that maximum torque output. When it comes to hybrids, though, however, because we're using the benefit of an electric motor that has 100% of its torque at effectively 1 RPM and up, we don't need to have a large internal combustion engine. Instead, we're using an internal combustion engine as an assistant to increasing power, or to maintain that that velocity. We can have a much smaller displacement, which results in lower emissions and lower overall fuel consumption at that point. Now, most of these hybrid vehicles, again, have gone away from nickel metal hydride batteries, and we're looking at lithium ion, primarily lithium polymer and lithium graphite batteries. They're far more stable battery chemistry than just regular lithium ion. Lithium ion can be very, very dangerous, and you can see many videos online of detractors from electric vehicles showing that, look, they catch on fire. Every vehicle catches on fire. There's not a single vehicle that has ever been produced that you could do a Google search for that you can't find images of it catching on fire. All vehicles catch on fire. When you move any type of machinery in a very compact area, that can happen. So don't let that be the end all be all, that we can't have electric vehicles because of that, because that's kind of a moot point at that point. Gasoline vehicles catch on fire. Transportation of gasoline can catch on fire. We just there's a bridge that collapsed in Pennsylvania because of that. It's one of those things that we're looking at. It is a risk, and it is out there. Now, why we've gone to a more unstable, nickel metal hydride was considered very stable. Downside was nickel metal hydride was not nearly as efficient. Lithium ion or lithium chemistry batteries are about 3 times more efficient per cell output than it was for nickel metal hydride. And we're looking at battery average cell output, the cell increase going up exponentially, and our overall voltage climbing quite high. 200 volts is pretty low now for a full hybrid vehicle. We do have a lot of vehicles that are plug-in hybrids. Now, these are going to have an internal combustion engine that can propel the vehicle. They're going to have the traditional electric motor with battery pack. However, we will rely on outside sources to increase the amount of charge that we can take at any one time. So we were plugging into a J1772 port typically to do level 2 charging, and we can effectively top the battery off. Now, a lot of these plug-in hybrids can have a full EV mode anywhere between 10 and 30 miles, depending on driving area and conditions. And that can vary from vehicle to vehicle. And a plug-in hybrid is a good option. It's, when I have people ask me, they want to have an electric vehicle, I kind of lean them more towards, hey, let's get you into a plug-in hybrid of some sort. And there's a variety out there. One of Toyota's best-selling vehicles right now is the RAV4 Prime, which is their hybrid version of the Toyota RAV4, but it's plug-in. I know there's 3 people in a 100-yard space that have all gotten the same one because of that. So it is a good option. Excuse me. In terms of propulsion. Now, when we look at that plug-in hybrid range, we need to make sure we have an understanding of that with the window sticker for buying a new car. So we can see that 98 miles per gallon. Well, there's that little E on the end there that we really want to make sure is understood, is that it's 98 miles per gallon for about a 34 mile kilowatt hour range. And that's per 100 miles. So we're looking at that probably being able to have a full, when we look at kind of breaking the math down, we're looking at that probably being able to have a full electrified range of around 20 miles, which for the most part, I would say is probably the average commute for you all to school or work. So you get at least, one trip or another trip or both trips fully EV at that point. The other option, is then when we're running as a traditional hybrid, and that's where we get that 38 miles per gallon. So it is more often we need to look at the gasoline only aspect of it. The plug-in portion of it can be very, very misleading. I get it. Oh, it gets 120 mpg on the end there. Then it's a little bit different. You're not going to be getting that effectively for a long period. It's just for a short period at this point. Now, I brought up, we were talking about full hybrids. We can also have mild hybrids. Now, mild hybrids were very popular in the late 90s, early 2000s with GM, and they've kind of come back. A couple other manufacturers have brought them out. Now, mild hybrid, we're looking at systems about 48 volts and lower. So it's typically 42 to 48 volts. The wiring for that, we're not having the high voltage orange wiring. We're having it either be blue or yellow. So blue or yellow wiring is going to be equivalent to 42 to 48 volts. And that's usually what these systems operate on. Now, these are going to be BAS systems or belt alternator starters. What this system does is it's going to do a couple things. It's going to allow us to be able to reduce the parasitic loss that we would have on the internal combustion engine from turning the all of the accessories, so power steering, water pump, AC, alternator, so on and so forth, and instead allowing us to have kind of a bit of a boost motor to it. Oddly enough, is one of those things that's a video game thing where you'd hit the boost button if you're doing a racing game. Well, that's actually coming into reality. The Dodge Hornet RT actually has a boost button that utilizes the system to give it a little bit of an electric bump for performance. We're seeing this quite often, though, for vehicles that are also equipped with stop start. That reduces the amount of emissions that is going to be given out during stops. Now, all of these different systems can be a little bit differently mounted. For the most part, when we're looking at a BAS, it's belt alternator starter. Honda employs theirs in between the transmission and the engine, and acts as a electric assist in lieu of a torque converter. And again, it's just a different option that you can have for the same type of vehicle. Now, when we're looking at these hybrid systems, either mild or full hybrids, there's going to be a couple different ways that we can have the drivetrain layouts. Now, series hybrids, we're going to have the drivetrain be exclusively powered by full electric mode. So the propulsion of the vehicle will be done by a motor generator unit only. There will be an onboard internal combustion engine, but that internal combustion engine will only be used to generate electricity. So it will be effectively a generator or a stationary generator at that point. Now, when we're looking at examples of this, we're looking at examples of this with the BMW i3, for instance. It has the option that you can have a range extension generator, which is a very small displacement engine on board that can give you about 60 more miles of extended range. The other options that you can see with this is like the Fisker Karma is another one of these that is out there. And we're going to get more and more of these. The rumored RX-9 is going to be a rotary generated series hybrid. And these are very, very simple in construction, and you get the benefits of the electric propulsion but you also have a way to extend your range out, and they will oftentimes be able to be plugged in as well. More commonly, what we see though is we're either going to see a parallel hybrid design or a series parallel design. Now, in a parallel only design, the internal combustion engine can power the motor generator unit, and then that in turn powers the vehicle down the road. However, what we more often see though is a series parallel drivetrain. This is what we see in most vehicles out on the road. Effectively, what we have is it operates off of two parallel drivetrain systems. We can have a full gas only through our outdrive system, or we can have it be fully electrified, or it can use both at the same time. Either way, it kind of is up to the vehicle and how the operator is driving that vehicle. Now, we're going to have two motor generators. Usually in that case, we're going to have a motor generator unit that is paired to the internal combustion engine that can then switch to a generator for the internal combustion engine to create electricity to go to the battery, or it can be used to power the vehicle. And then motor generator 2 usually operates as propelling the vehicle, or it can be used as a generator when under regenerative braking, which we talked about in chapter 15 with braking systems. We can have that regenerative braking effect. So series parallel hybrids are more often what you're saying. It's what all the Priuses are, the Fords, so on and so forth. They're operating off of that system, and the systems are very, very similar. They're almost all using two motor generator units. Unless it's all-wheel drive, then we're going to have a third motor generator unit, typically on the back axle, and it acts more as a conventional electric drivetrain in the rear than it would in the front. So again, we kind of get that as an effect. Now, these series hybrid, series parallel hybrid vehicles, they don't really have a traditional transmission per se. What they do have is they have an outdriver drive unit. They will have a gear ratio split between each one of the drive units, and it's all connected through a very simple planetary gear set. So the planetary gear set that I have pictured here is what you would see on an average Toyota. So the internal combustion engine would be splined and attached to the planet carrier, which is the middle blue gears. Those gears are all considered one unit. The sun gear would be motor generator 1, which would also then act as a generator with the internal combustion engine. And then the ring gear would be connected to motor generator 2, which would be the propulsion motor and regenerative braking motor. Now, it is one of those things that all three of those drive devices, motor generator 1, motor generator 2, and the internal combustion engine would be splined to an individual one of these components. That component would then be applying power, and that would then propel the vehicle down the road. This output for the planetary gear set would be one of the other members not used. Now, I brought up stop-start systems, and we can have that in all methods of hybrids. We can also have it in non-hybrid vehicles. In fact, in a lot of countries like Japan, for instance, it is illegal for you to idle a vehicle at a stoplight. You actually have to shut the vehicle off. So that's where we started to see stop-start technology come in place. Now, a lot of people can scoff at stop-start technology. I'll be honest with you. I work on a lot of vehicles with that technology in place, and every time it gets me. I get the, and that's because being a mechanic working on the vehicle, you may have done a bunch of repair, and you'll come to a stoplight, and you're on a test drive, and then the vehicle dies, and you're like, oh God, what did I do to blow the motor? Ultimately, it comes down to, it does take a little bit of getting used to. Effectively, what it is, it's a system that shuts the engine off when coming to a stoplight to reduce the amount of gasoline consumed. And it can save anywhere, depending on where it's being driven, anywhere between 8% upwards of 12% in a lot of cases. Now, oftentimes, people will think like, well, doesn't it do damage to the engine, and doesn't it doing a lot of damage to the starter? And the answer to both of those is no. The starters on these systems are much more robust. Atypically, we're going to have a second battery that will allow for the vehicle to stay alive during, electrically stay alive, I should say. So radio, lights, and everything, computer awake while it's stopped, run the AC, so on and so forth. And in terms of reducing wear on the engine, it's actually better to shut the engine off at idle. Engines don't like to be at idle. Oil pressure is a lot lower. They heat soak and absorb a lot more heat, and they aren't as efficient. So if you shut an engine off every time it's at idle and then you just turn it on for when it goes up in its rev range, you're actually doing less damage. Average stoplight, depending on where you're at, I know there's a couple lights in Mission Viejo that I dread having to stop at because they feel like they're 2 minutes. I know they're not that long, but they feel like it. But on average, you're looking at anywhere between 15 seconds to about 45 seconds as an average stop time at a red light. That's not enough time to completely lose all oil pressure or the oil to be then returned to the pan. So it's not going to do any damage to the internal combustion engine. The starter motor is built to be more robust. The systems are very, very reliable. The Achilles heel in it usually is the small 12-volt batteries. For the vehicles that I deal with Chrysler, we have a normal lead acid or AGM battery that would be very conventional. You're looking at 800 cold cranking amps, something around there. And we'd have a secondary battery to keep the vehicle alive electrically, and you're looking at it being 100 to 200. It's very, very similar. In fact, it's exactly the same construction as a power sport battery you'd see in an ATV side by side, so on and so forth. So very, very small battery. That's the Achilles heel is the batteries. They don't last very long, which is an easy fix in most cases. So it's not that big of a deal. Now, we will still have to have a 12-volt battery for all hybrid vehicles and fully electric vehicles. We'll have the high voltage battery pack that's going to be used for primarily propulsion, but the high voltage battery pack can also be used for power steering and for AC and climate control. But we do have to have a 12-volt battery to wake everything up. We're going to be messing around with a couple fully electrified vehicles in class. I have basically kit cars that are completely tube chassis that we'll be looking at, and they will have the ability to be able to experience an electric vehicle kind of very raw. They have a 12-volt battery on board. The 12-volt battery is used to maintain and operate the lights and operating functions of the computers, so on and so forth. And then the high voltage battery pack is what's used to propel the vehicle down the road. In the case of our vehicles, are 72 volts. They're really, really light little three-wheeled things that you guys will get to experience in lab. However, though, again, even the biggest, baddest Tesla, Lucid, or any of those vehicles do have a 12-volt battery. The 12-volt battery on a lot of high voltage systems will be used to wake all the systems up, and then again operate everything else like the radio, so on and so forth. Now, the high voltage battery packs, there is a big danger and risk to anyone working on these vehicles. These systems have very, very high voltage. So anything that is colored orange is going to be considered a full hybrid. Again, as we brought up a couple slides back, it will be operating off of 144 volts and up. 144 volts is what the first Honda Insight and Toyota Priuses ran as voltage. We've since gone much higher. The average hybrid vehicle and electric vehicles anywhere between 400 to 900 volts with very, very high amperage coming off of that. Now, for safety of maintaining and repairing these vehicles, they will have battery disconnects. Downside is the battery disconnects can be located almost anywhere in the vehicle. There is no standardization with that. In fact, there's not even standardization from model to model. We have a bunch of different variants of the Toyota Prius, and downside is that every generation of Prius has a different high voltage disconnect and a different process in terms of removing it. It is imperative. The most important thing you need to be doing when working on a high voltage vehicle is refer to service information. You have to refer to service information to follow the steps to fully discharging the system. Now, if you're doing something on a hybrid like changing the oil, so if I gave you a Prius to change the oil on, you don't have to do a high voltage battery pack discharge on that, or changing the radio, or changing the serpentine belt. You don't have to do that. It's just when we're messing with the high voltage battery systems. So it is very, very important that we follow all precautions, wear all the proper PPE, and that we are following the service information when looking at that. And that goes for full EV vehicles too. We have the ability to have that disconnect on those as well. Now, we have much greater options in terms of EV vehicles now. Again, don't really focus so much on the maximum range. So when we look at, well, you know, a Nissan Leaf only gets 107 miles, the reality is it is a little bit less than that. One of the big things that's going to kind of separate electric vehicles is charging rate. Now, this is going to be for specifically 100% electric vehicles. However, this is going to kind of relate to plug-in hybrids as well. We have three major charging networks that you can charge an electric vehicle off of. There's level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 is the slowest. Level 1 is effectively you're plugging into 120 volt power source at your house. Most electric vehicles, that's what they all come equipped with from the factory, is their 120 volt systems. That's the kind of the catch-all that they get. Now, depending on how much you draw down the main battery voltage, it's anywhere between 12 and 24 hours. We've seen, we have a Nissan Leaf that we use as a shop vehicle. And we've seen that battery takes a lot more to charge, especially as it's gotten older, because it's a several years old now vehicle. And it takes upwards of about 26 to 28 hours to fully charge. And we only get about 90 miles of charge on that particular vehicle. So we're not getting as far as we would ultimately like to get. But it is kind of, you know, just the way of the world at that point. Now, more often than not, we're going to see level 2 chargers. Now, these are often the charge points that you see all around malls and stuff like that. The level 2 charger is going to be much higher voltage. We're looking at 240 volt plus. So we're looking at anywhere between that and some of them are 320. It kind of depends on the infrastructure and where all you're plugging in. Most vehicles are going to use a generalized plug. There is a standard J1772 plug or plug receptacle, and some manufacturers will have a secondary plug to go along with that. And depending, you're looking at, you know, a couple hours to charge the vehicle in that case. This is what most people are going to use. You can get a level 2 charger installed at your house. And that seems to be the best option in terms of if you have an electric vehicle, because you can charge it overnight. So if you're going off of the lower voltage and amperage rating, you can charge it, you know, for a 6-hour period when the vehicle's not being used, off peak hours, and your electric bill won't be that high, I should say. And then the last one is going to be level 3 charging. Now, this is very high amperage, very high voltage charging, 480 plus, and you're looking at in a matter of minutes of charging. 15 minutes is pretty ambitious. That's in my experience, I haven't seen anyone get 15 minutes. 20 minutes to 40-ish, 45 minutes is usually within the range. The important thing to understand here with level 3 and level 2 charging is that depending on the amount of demand on that charge station or on that area of the grid, it's going to slow you down quite a bit. So as I brought up before, if you are at a charging station and there's 20 stalls and 18 of them or 19 of them are taken up and you're going on that last stall, everyone's going to have a slower rate of charge because of the amount of energy output that station is going to be putting out. So you kind of want to be very strategic in when you're going to go get your vehicle charged. You want to look at trying to get it charged off-peak time, if possible. It's not always possible, and it's kind of difficult. So it is one of those things that you do kind of want to have an understanding with and have a game plan to go along with. The other thing to kind of bear in mind is the days of free electrical charging are gone. There was a lot of places that you could do level 1 and level 2 charging at no cost. Have an understanding that if there's a way to make money, people are going to charge you for it. If someone could figure out how to make you pay for the air you're breathing, believe me, they would. They would definitely make that a business, and that would be one of the things that would be the case. So if you're getting your vehicle charged at your employer for free, the best thing you can do to make it last as long as possible, where they're not charging you or they're not making you pay an allocation for the electric bill, is to be as courteous as possible, which I've very rarely ran into anyone that has an electric vehicle that's not 100% courteous. Usually that they're extremely understanding. Now on campus, we have electric car chargers. And they're at a discounted rate. We actually get a grant to be able to have a discounted rate. It's 25 cents a kilowatt hour for the first 3 hours, and then $1 a kilowatt hour additionally on top of that. Now, the charge stations do have the mandate that if your vehicle does get topped off, and they're all level 2 chargers, but if it does top the system off, you have 45 minutes to move your vehicle, or you do get a parking ticket that goes along with your charge. And that's pretty atypical. I've seen charge rates kind of vary. And those of you that are driving electric vehicles probably can attest to that, depending on the time of day, depending on the demand. You can look at, taking a vehicle from 20%, so effectively empty for an electric vehicle, up to 80%, which is full, anywhere between costing 15 to 45, $50 a charge. So it is one of those things that when we're looking cost effective wise, we're kind of losing the ability for electric vehicles to be more cost effective unless you're charging at home. If you have the ability to charge at home, and you're charging off peak hours, and it's not that big a deal, and you're charging at a much slower rate. So, it is something to kind of take a look at. It is important to understand too that we don't really want to hyper focus on that range, although that range is something that is a key factor with electric vehicle operation, and that's that range anxiety. And there's really no way to explain it unless you experience it. Unless you have an electric vehicle and you experience range anxiety, it's kind of foreign. Some of you may have experienced it if you have a gasoline vehicle and you've gone on like a really long road trip to somewhere a little bit more rural that like a gas station is kind of harder to come by. That might be one thing, but when you're looking at range anxiety, it is something that is legitimately like, it's a fear. I've had it a bunch of times driving our electric vehicles where you're like, what am I going to do? And it's that, am I going to make it to a charge station, and how long am I going to have to be at that charge station for? And you're kind of doing in your head on like, okay, if I turn the radio off, if I turn the AC off, if I'm really linear on my power and braking, can I coast as much as possible to get as much regenerative braking in place? All of that stuff kind of keys into it, and it can be a very, very stressful endeavor. And the range can range wild, or can vary wildly on your drive. When we're driving our Leaf, if we have to drive up to Irvine, if it's pretty free flowing traffic on the way up to Irvine, usually it's not that bad. Usually our range will only drop by 2 or 3 miles, but then on the way back, even though it's like an 8-mile drive, we will decrease by, upwards sometimes of 20 miles, especially if it's really slow going, stop and go traffic. So it is something that's temperature specific, topography specific. So how steep a grade you're driving the vehicle up, all of that kind of is a key characteristic. So you definitely want to make sure you're planning ahead of time. Now, we are looking at electric vehicle propulsion kind of moving into new realms. So we're looking at, we will always be using AC synchronous 3-pole motors. That's kind of the key technology that we are implementing in the industry now. But we're going to a hub motor design. You can see these on the 2nd generation NSX. So the new Acura NSX that's out, they have hub motors. In the front, it's a hybrid all-wheel drive. The rear engine operates with a high revving V6 and an electric motor, and then the front axle is 2 hub motors. The benefit to this is we can kind of change the bodies as needed. So we can have a 100% EV chassis, and we can put whatever body we want on it. Now, manufacturers that are kind of really amping up to kind of change the operation of this is Volkswagen and General Motors. Now, Tesla, their drive units for the most part, for their very, very old model run years, are all basically the same, and the suspension and chassis that they're using is older E-Series Mercedes stuff, all the suspension links, K-frame, so on and so forth. But effectively, if you have the battery as the floor, you can change the body around. So Volkswagen, for instance, is going to have a bunch of different variants off the exact same electric platform. and the bodies can almost be changed very, very quickly. So there's an option for a four-source sedan. There's an option for a unibody small pickup truck. And then the one that everyone's really excited for is the microbus, the one that looks like a vintage Type 72 Volkswagen bus. So again, we're looking at that being kind of a different option that we can have. Now, this slide is a little bit misleading. So with 100% EV, you eliminate the need of refilling. There's no mufflers, rust out, no oil changes, just firmware updates. That's not true. That what that's implying is that there is no vehicle maintenance, and that is inherently not true. There's a lot of vehicle maintenance when it comes to electric vehicles. It's just different. We do have to change out air filters. There's air filters for the cabin system and for the passive cooling for the battery system. Those have to be changed at a regular basis, and they are about quadruple the cost of a normal air filter and about quadruple the amount of work. We have cooling system loops that we do have to maintain. Wheels and tires, they need far more tire rotations, and the tires get eaten up through at a far greater rate than they would in normal situations. Now, where it says no rusting, no rusting out. Yeah, there's no mufflers, but there is corrosion. There is bushings, suspension components. Effectively, if you're looking at, man, I don't want to become a mechanic because there's no parts on an electric car. There is. All we've changed out is the propulsion device. Everything else is the same. Brakes, suspension, infotainment, the doors, body panels, lighting, all of that stuff is the exact same as every other vehicle on the road. It's just we've changed the propulsion unit. I have a couple friends that do work for Tesla, and they tell me they do a lot of drive motors. So they are doing the same kind of thing that you would be doing on a regular vehicle. It's just a little bit different. That's all. So don't be looking at it as a downside with that. Now, we brought this up at the very beginning when we looked at electrical generation. An electric vehicle does not have measurable tailpipe emissions because it doesn't have a tailpipe. There is emissions coming off of the composites and plastics and the paints and everything. That is something that, through UV exposure, there is emissions coming off of an electric vehicle. There's emissions coming off of everything. So that is one of those things that to call it zero emission is just for the propulsion side of it. Now, the problem lies in where we're actually generating our electricity. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier. And the downside to electric vehicles is where we get our electricity from varies greatly. Now, this is a chart via 2019 standards. We have kind of shifted away because we've lost a lot of nuclear. Nuclear power is the option that I feel is kind of best, only because there is no immediate emissions. We do have toxic waste after, but we can mitigate that. And there are fueling stations, like France uses nuclear power stations that uses 100% recycled radioactive material. So it is one of those things that we can build fission reactors to operate off of recycled material, and nuclear fission is what is the predominant nuclear power. We are working on nuclear fusion reactors. There is a fusion reactor experiment being done down in San Diego. I've gone and toured it. It's an incredibly fascinating facility. I was more awestruck at all of the welding that they did. Just the amount of aluminum and titanium welding that they had. Those fabricators were next level. But we're not quite at the nuclear fusion stage. Nuclear fusion is far cleaner than fission. Fission is where we're splitting atoms. Fusion is where we're combining atoms. And the byproducts are less dangerous in fusion than fission, and we have better power output. Again, that's future sense. What we're looking at are predominantly 33% coal, 33% natural gas. So we got about 66% of our power generation is still relying on fossil fuels. So effectively, we're just kicking the can down the road until we kind of change our way with that. That's gonna be a little bit different. The other one that is found to be not as reliable, and also too, we're kind of having a better understanding of the environmental impact, is hydropower. Hydropower being where we actually dam up a river, create a reservoir, and limit how much flow we have coming through to turn turbines. That's one of those things that we don't have the ability to be able to do as easily. It is, with the varying water levels in a lot of our reservoirs that we saw this summer, that's not a reliable source of energy. On top of, it's bad for the environment because we're doing habitat displacement. So there's a lot of hydro dams that are now being removed. Obviously, they're not going to remove the Hoover Dam. That's going to be like one of the last things they do. That's where we get a lot of electric power. But that was a big fear, right? The Lake Mead is still dropping at a considerable rate, to where, you know, we can rush to where or get to where it's a dead pool and we can't produce electricity out of that. Wind is another one that's kind of you know, contested with environmentalists, because it kills transitory birds. I also too, like my dad, for instance, he absolutely thinks that wind turbines are the ugliest thing on the planet. I think they're kind of nice looking. I don't mind a bunch of, you know, big giant propellers on the landscape, but again, there's only so many areas we can do that. We also are only generating electricity with wind and solar with when there's the sun's out, because the wind is blowing typically when the sun is out. Same thing with solar. We have to have a storage. That's not when our peak energy is. Our peak energy is towards the evening. Now, geothermal and biomass, those are two that are not used nearly enough. Biomass is where we're actually able to capture the methane that comes off of waste products, typically from animals, but we can also do it off of humans and burn that, which is considered a carbon neutral source. And then geothermal is where we capture electrical energy, or we capture the energy released as thermal energy off of naturally occurring thermal vents, and have that turn a turbine and create electricity. Geothermal is truly the greenest of green energies. There's no bad byproduct from it whatsoever. Nor is it really habitat destruction or anything like that, because we're kind of capturing stuff off of sulfur sulfur hot springs that nothing lives on anyways. So it is one of those things that there's, you know, a bunch of different ways to do it, and it's not always going to be the same thing. We talked about extended range hybrid vehicles as a range extension engine. Now let's get into some of the really kind of out there stuff that's out that is being proposed. Solar vehicles are one. Solar vehicles are an option that seemed very far-fetched. They used to do a big solar race in Africa and in Australia to show how far the photovoltaic cells can power a vehicle. There are a couple companies that are bringing this out. There's a company called Aptera that they claim to have 1,000-mile range electric vehicle. It's a 3-wheeled vehicle that has photovoltaic cells across the entire body, and that's how it can have that extended range. And it is an option that we can have. Is it going to be the only way that we're propelling a vehicle? No. Will it be an option for us to have? Yeah, absolutely. Our Nissan Leaf, it actually has a small solar panel on the roof meant for keeping the battery climate control system working. Others will have it for accessory drives where it's a small panel, but it is something that there is an option for. Another one that's a little bit out there is compressed air vehicles or pneumatic vehicles. Effectively, what we're doing is we're using compressed air, not natural gas or anything like that, just regular air to move the pistons in a traditional internal combustion engine to power vehicles. Where we see this is in a lot of the northern Scandinavian countries. They're experimenting around with these. I think the technology is interesting, but probably not viable. But it is, again, a different option that is out there. Now, another thing that we're seeing along kind of going hand in hand with electric vehicles that we'll talk about for the next couple slides here to kind of wrap everything up is our slowly but surely going with vehicles more autonomous. We're getting systems now that can operate vehicles remotely. That being said, we're pretty far from vehicles being self-driving. We're very far from that technology kind of taking everything over. But there are a lot of different systems that we can have to allow for vehicles to have added safety features. When we look at radar systems looking for forward-facing cameras in the front, when we look at sonic sensors for parking assist, and when we look at like 360 surround cameras. Now, fully automated vehicles. Again, this slide needs to be updated because yes, Tesla has it. they've turned it all off, and they've turned it all off based off of topics that we talked about in chapter 15 for our braking systems. It is one of those things that it's new technology, and it does take a lot of work and effort, and we don't necessarily have the road surface and roadwise to do that. So now to kind of turn everything, back in around on itself, to kind of wrap the topic up, we do want to have an understanding that there's going to be different ways that we can have alternative propulsion vehicles. There's going to be multiple different ways in how we can propel vehicles, and that's okay. There's nothing the matter. Not any one thing needs to be what everyone uses. We kind of need to get away from that mindset. We want to make sure that we hit a couple bullet points, that the fuel source is sustainable, it's renewable, it's practical, environmentally friendly, and then overall cost effective for the end user. And that's going to be the main thing that we really want to make sure that we're looking at for cost effective propulsion down the road. Now, I'm going to try to introduce you to a couple of these different types of systems in the lab when we have that. I know this is kind of a bit of a long lecture, but it was a big topic. There's a lot to kind of go into. So I hope you found it entertaining, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks, everyone.